Hey dude, let's not sugarcoat it. Ancient Egypt looks cool from a distance. Pyramids, gold, temples. But here's the truth. If you got dropped into the real thing, you wouldn't make it past breakfast. The sun, unforgiving. The food, barely enough. And unless you were born into royalty, which, spoiler alert, you weren't, your job was hard, your back hurt constantly, and your life wasn't even really yours. You worked in the heat, slept on dirt, and hoped you didn't get an infection, because there were no doctors, just prayers and guesswork. And that eyeliner you've seen in the paintings, yeah, it was lead. They were literally poisoning their own faces. Tonight we're pulling back the fantasy and sinking into what life was actually like for the average Egyptian. No gold, no magic, just humans like us trying to get through another brutal day. Before we step back in time, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. Only if you're into this kind of slow, honest history that makes you feel something while your body powers down. And drop a comment. Where are you listening from? What time is it? Are you in bed yet, or still trying to calm your brain? Now kill the lights. Get still. And if you've got someone beside you, give them a look like, we would have died out there. If you're alone, same here. We've got this. Let's fall asleep to the version of history nobody talks about, the hard one, the real one, the one full of dirt, sweat, and silent strength. You wouldn't have lasted a day in ancient Egypt. But tonight, you don't have to. Welcome to ancient Egypt, a land of grand monuments, royal tombs, and pharaohs. Might appear to be a place of awe and wonder through the lens of modern history. But the truth of daily life in Egypt was far less glamorous and far more demanding than any modern-day imagination could conjure. While Egypt's towering pyramids and the Great Sphinx capture our fascination, the daily lives of its inhabitants were grueling, unrelenting, and often short. To truly understand why you wouldn't last a day in ancient Egypt, we must begin with the harsh realities faced by the common people, the farmers, workers, and slaves, who built the very monuments we celebrate today. In the beginning, one would wake to the scorching heat of an unforgiving sun, especially in the Nile Delta, where most Egyptians lived. The land, while fertile, required constant labor to cultivate. Farmers would spend their days tilling the land under the harsh sun, often beginning work at sunrise and continuing until nightfall. The heat was stifling, the air thick with dust, and the only relief came from the cool waters of the Nile, which would flood annually, providing fertile soil, but also creating a massive challenge in maintaining irrigation systems. Food, a basic necessity for survival, was not as readily available as one might think. The staple diet was simple, consisting primarily of bread and beer, with little variety. The rich, however, enjoyed lavish feasts, while the common folk rarely had access to fresh fruits, vegetables, or meat, save for special occasions. Meals were humble and often monotonous, with the quality of food differing greatly between social classes. As you walk through the bustling streets of Thebes or Memphis, you would notice the disorganization of the urban sprawl, where no proper sanitation system existed. The city was full of open sewage, and waste disposal was an afterthought. It was not uncommon for people to bathe in the Nile, which doubled as a water source for drinking, washing, and disposal. Diseases spread quickly, and there was little understanding of hygiene or the science behind illnesses. Epidemics ravaged the population, and survival was often a game of luck rather than medical knowledge. While the pyramids are monumental and symbolic of ancient Egypt's grandeur, the laborers who constructed them endured unimaginable hardship. They were not slaves, as commonly believed, but conscripted laborers who worked under severe conditions. They were often provided with just enough food and water to keep them alive, but the work itself, cutting and moving massive stones, was grueling, requiring immense physical strength and endurance. The workers had no protection from the heat, the dust, or the constant strain of carrying massive stones from quarries to construction sites. Despite the dangers and hardships of life in ancient Egypt, the sense of community, religious belief, and connection to the divine sustained many. The gods, with their temples, rituals, and offerings, provided the ancient Egyptians with a sense of purpose, even amidst the daily grind. But the real question is, how did these ordinary people survive? And would you last a day in ancient Egypt, surviving in a harsh environment with little reprieve, limited resources, and constant labor? Imagine the overwhelming heat, the scarcity of food, and the mental and physical toll of a lifetime of hard work. Would you have the resilience to endure it? Surviving in ancient Egypt was no small feat, especially when facing the constant challenges of the environment, societal structures, and the demands of daily life. Those who managed to make it through each day relied not only on their physical strength, but also on a complex set of survival strategies. In this section, we'll delve into the ways in which the average Egyptian coped with life in a harsh world. One of the primary challenges for anyone living in Egypt was the relentless heat. In cities like Thebes, Luxor, and Memphis, temperatures could soar above 100 degrees F, 38 degrees C, for much of the year, especially during the scorching summer months. The average person would be exposed to this heat from dawn to dusk. Shade was a luxury, and most people worked outdoors in the blazing sun, with only a thin linen tunic to protect them from the elements. The survival strategies employed by the ancient Egyptians were deeply rooted in their understanding of the natural world. To cope with the heat, Egyptians devised cooling techniques that seem surprisingly modern. They used straw mats to provide shade, and many homes had walls made of mud bricks, which helped insulate against the heat. The wealthy, of course, had more sophisticated cooling methods, including large courtyards with fountains. But for the majority of the population, survival was a matter of enduring and adapting. Water was another critical resource. While the Nile River provided much-needed irrigation and fresh water, its seasonal flooding created both a blessing and a curse. During the flood season, the Nile would swell, submerging crops and homes. Though the flooding eventually brought nutrient-rich silt that replenished the soil, the river also had the potential to destroy the crops and livelihoods of countless farmers. The ancient Egyptians developed an intricate system of dikes, canals, and reservoirs to try to manage the floodwaters. But even with these measures, the floods could be unpredictable, sometimes destroying entire harvests and plunging people into starvation. Food scarcity was a constant concern. Most Egyptians subsisted on a diet of barley, wheat, bread, and beer, with vegetables like onions, leeks, and garlic supplementing their meals. But fresh meat, fish, and fruit were luxury items reserved for the wealthy. For the average laborer, food was often a daily struggle. During lean times, they would rely on dried bread, which was dunked in beer to soften it, an efficient, though not particularly appetizing, solution. The work itself was punishing. Farmers toiled in the fields from sunrise to sunset, planting and harvesting crops with little time for rest. The concept of labor unions did not exist in ancient Egypt, so the workers had little power to change their circumstances. While they were not slaves, their work was often forced upon them, and the ruling class dictated their schedules and workload. Large projects like the construction of the pyramids, temples, and tombs required a vast, mobilized workforce that worked under grueling conditions. Workers, often conscripted from their villages, were housed in temporary, overcrowded camps near the construction sites. The workers' conditions were dire. Many of the laborers on pyramid projects lived in small mud brick shelters with poor ventilation and little protection from the elements. Disease spread easily in these conditions, with infections caused by open wounds, poor hygiene, and contaminated food or water. Malaria, dysentery, and other diseases were common, and the death rate among the laborers was high. Despite the harsh conditions, many workers died in service to the pharaohs, without ever seeing the completion of the projects they worked on. In the face of these overwhelming challenges, Egyptians relied on their belief system for strength. Religion played a central role in coping with adversity. The Egyptian gods, each governing different aspects of life, were called upon regularly for protection, fertility, and sustenance. Temples were not just places of worship, they were centers of power, where the pharaoh, seen as a living god, would perform rituals to appease the deities. It was believed that maintaining favor with the gods was vital to ensuring the continued survival of the kingdom. The daily prayers, sacrifices, and offerings made to the gods were central to Egyptian life. These rituals were performed not only by priests, but by individuals as well. Even in the face of hardship, the Egyptians believed that the gods were watching over them, guiding them, and ensuring that the forces of nature aligned to benefit them. Whether they were farmers, artisans, or builders, Egyptians lived with a profound understanding that survival was not just about physical endurance. It was also about maintaining spiritual harmony with the world around them. However, while the gods provided some semblance of hope, the reality for most Egyptians was that survival depended on the simple, mundane tasks of daily life. There was no room for luxury or escape. The relentless grind of farming, building, and maintaining the irrigation systems meant that even the slightest misstep could have dire consequences. For the majority of the population, there was little chance to escape from the unyielding demands of work and the harsh realities of living in such an unforgiving environment. But the real question remains, could you survive in ancient Egypt, where every day was a fight for survival against the elements, disease, and a rigid social structure? Could you endure the physical strain of manual labor, the constant exposure to the harsh sun, and the unpredictable Nile floods? Could you handle the tedium of daily life and the unrelenting grind of subsistence farming? As we reach the final chapter of our exploration into the life of the average Egyptian, we begin to understand that survival was not just a daily struggle. It was a matter of enduring a system that allowed little room for rest, relief, or escape. While ancient Egypt is celebrated for its majestic monuments and grandiose history, the truth is that the common person's existence was defined by hardship, physical labor, and a constant effort to appease the gods. Yet, despite the overwhelming difficulties, the resilience of these people led to the creation of one of the most enduring civilizations in history. The physical toll of Egyptian life was immense, especially for the workers involved in large-scale projects like the building of the pyramids. As discussed, workers were often conscripted into labor for extended periods, living in temporary camps far from their homes. The work itself was physically grueling, with massive stones being quarried, transported, and then set into place under the scorching desert sun. There was little room for error. Each stone had to be carefully shaped, lifted, and placed with precision, all while the worker's strength was sapped by the relentless heat and dust. The mental strain was equally severe. The workers, though not slaves, lived under the constant watch of supervisors and foremen. Their schedules were dictated by the demands of the pharaoh, and the labor was often relentless. There was no luxury of rest, no time for leisure. Even when the workday ended, there were no quiet nights to look forward to. The workers had to sleep in overcrowded conditions, surrounded by the sounds of the construction site, the cries of sick comrades, and the constant worry about the future. As for the rest of the population, survival came down to the same principles: relentless work, scarce resources, and a society structured to favor the elite. For the vast majority of Egyptians, life was one of hardship and deprivation, with the only reprieve being brief moments of religious rituals or communal gatherings. The social hierarchy was rigid, and most people had little hope of ever improving their lot. the vast majority of Egyptians were peasants, bound to the land, struggling to make ends meet. They farmed the land, harvested crops, and paid taxes to the pharaoh in the form of grain and other goods. If they could not meet their quotas, they faced severe punishment, often in the form of corporal punishment or forced labor on public projects. Religion played a central role in shaping the daily lives of the Egyptians. It was their beliefs in the gods that allowed them to endure the hardships of life. The pharaoh, as the living embodiment of Horus on earth, was seen as the ultimate intermediary between the gods and the people. The concept of mad or cosmic order was central to Egyptian thought. It was believed that as long as the pharaoh and the priests maintained the order of the universe, society would thrive. But for the common people, this concept didn't translate into personal freedom. Instead, it reinforced their sense of submission to the divine will of the gods, which was enacted through the authority of the pharaoh. Even after death, the Egyptian struggle continued. The ancient Egyptians believed that the soul lived on in the afterlife, but this was not a guaranteed fate. In fact, the afterlife was something that had to be earned, and it required a significant amount of preparation. The wealthier Egyptians had the resources to afford elaborate tombs, mummification, and grave goods that would ensure a smooth journey to the afterlife. For the common folk, however, death was often a final, unsung end. Their bodies were not mummified, and their graves were small and unmarked. Many were buried in mass graves, with no personal wealth or tribute to help them in the afterlife. But despite the overwhelming struggles, the ancient Egyptians left a legacy that endures to this day. The pyramids, the temples, and the tombs still stand as testament to the resilience of a people who, despite their harsh lives, managed to create one of the most advanced and enduring civilizations in history. Their achievements in mathematics, engineering, medicine, and art continue to inspire awe and admiration across the world. So, what can we learn from the struggles of ancient Egyptians? Perhaps it is the lesson of resilience, how, even in the face of adversity, people are able to adapt, survive, and leave an indelible mark on history. The common Egyptians lived lives that were grueling, monotonous, and often cut short. Yet, they endured, they survived, and their achievements still resonate with us thousands of years later. In contrast to our modern world, where conveniences abound and survival is rarely a daily concern, the people of ancient Egypt lived in a constant state of struggle. And the question remains, could you survive in such a world? Could you endure the physical, mental, and emotional toll of daily life in ancient Egypt? Would you have the resilience to live and work under such conditions? Or would the pressure of survival prove too much? As you ponder these questions, it becomes clear that survival in ancient Egypt required more than just strength. It required a sense of purpose, an understanding of the forces that governed the world, and an unwavering commitment to the gods and the pharaoh. It was a life defined by hardship, but also by the pursuit of something greater, a belief that, through toil and suffering, one could contribute to a civilization that would last for millennia. When we think of ancient Rome, we often imagine the grandeur of its empire, its magnificent buildings, towering aqueducts, and the legendary gladiators who fought for glory. But behind the wealth and power of Rome lay a harsh reality: slavery. Slaves were the backbone of Roman society, and their lives were anything but glorious. They were the laborers, the workers, the property of others, with little freedom and no rights. In this first section, we will explore the life of a Roman slave, from their origins and treatment to the brutal work they were forced to do. Life as a slave in Rome was marked by relentless labor, constant fear of punishment, and a complete lack of autonomy. A slave's life often began with tragedy. Many were prisoners of war, captured during Rome's military conquests across Europe, Asia, and Africa. Others were born into slavery, their fate sealed from birth. These individuals had no family name, no status, and no rights. They were viewed as tools, objects to be bought and sold at the whim of their masters. While some slaves were able to improve their status through education or performing skilled labor, the vast majority lived their lives in servitude, struggling to survive each day. The daily life of a slave in Rome was exhausting and demoralizing. Most slaves worked from dawn until dusk, with little time for rest. Their tasks were varied, depending on their assigned duties, but all of them were grueling. Household slaves, particularly those in wealthy Roman homes, would spend their days cleaning, cooking, and caring for their masters' families. They had little to no privacy, often sleeping in the same room as their masters, with little more than a straw mat to sleep on. In contrast, slaves working on farms or in mines had even harder lives. They were subjected to brutal physical labor tending fields under the scorching sun, or laboring in the dark and dangerous mines for long hours with little protection. Slaves who worked in the mines had some of the worst fates imaginable. Mining was a life-threatening job, with slaves forced to work in dangerous, confined spaces. The air was thick with dust, the risk of collapse was constant, and disease spread quickly in such unsanitary conditions. Those who survived the grueling conditions often became too weak or ill to continue working. These slaves were viewed as expendable. Their labor was valuable, but their lives were not. For the slaves working in Rome's bustling cities, the situation was slightly better, but not much. They often worked in shops or served as laborers on construction sites, building the very structures that would come to symbolize Rome's power. These laborers worked long hours under the hot Mediterranean sun, laying bricks, transporting materials, and constructing roads and buildings with little regard for their health or safety. And when it came time for rest, there was no relaxation, no reprieve from the harsh conditions of their daily lives. Punishment was a constant threat in the life of a Roman slave. If a slave failed to perform their work adequately, or if they were caught attempting to escape or rebel, they faced brutal punishment. a master had complete authority over their slaves, and it was not uncommon for slaves to be whipped, beaten, or even executed for disobedience. Public executions, particularly crucifixions, were common forms of punishment for slaves who attempted to escape or resist their masters. These gruesome acts were often carried out as a public spectacle, designed to serve as a warning to other slaves about the consequences of defiance. The fear of punishment kept many slaves in line, but it also bred resentment. Some slaves tried to escape their brutal circumstances, and many slaves joined uprisings, hoping to overthrow the oppressive system. The most famous of these uprisings was led by Spartacus, a gladiator who, in 73 BCE, escaped from a gladiatorial training school and formed an army of slaves to fight against Rome's oppressive masters. Despite initial successes, Spartacus and his army were ultimately defeated, and the repercussions were severe. Thousands of slaves were crucified along the Appian Way as a grim reminder of the consequences of rebellion. While the system of slavery in Rome may seem utterly oppressive, it was not entirely without its moments of grace or humanity. Some slaves who were able to earn the trust of their masters were given more responsibilities, and they could rise to positions of importance, such as managing their master's finances or overseeing other slaves. Some slaves even bought their freedom, a rare but not impossible occurrence. However, the vast majority of slaves lived in constant fear and poverty, struggling to survive in a system that saw them as nothing more than tools for labor. The brutal treatment of slaves in ancient Rome was justified by a deeply ingrained belief in the social hierarchy. Slaves were considered property, not people. They had no voice in their own lives and were at the mercy of their masters, who held all the power. This power dynamic was reinforced by Roman law, which granted masters the right to punish and control their slaves however they saw fit. Despite these hardships, some slaves managed to carve out a semblance of life for themselves, forming bonds with fellow slaves or finding solace in religion. However, most lived their entire lives under the oppressive yoke of slavery, with no hope of escape or freedom. As we conclude this first section, the question arises: how did Roman society justify the brutal system of slavery, and what impact did it have on the culture and economy of the empire? The answer lies in the very foundation of Roman society, its reliance on conquest, expansion, and the exploitation of those conquered. The Roman Empire was built on the backs of slaves, and without their labor, the empire may not have been able to sustain its massive infrastructure and military dominance. As we continue exploring the life of a Roman slave, we delve deeper into the broader social and economic impact of slavery in the Roman Empire. It is clear that slaves were not just the labor force, they were the backbone of the entire empire. Their work in fields, homes, mines, and cities shaped Roman society in ways that went far beyond the daily grind of menial labor. Slavery in Rome was not merely an institution, it was a cornerstone of the Roman economy, one that influenced everything from the social hierarchy to the empire's vast infrastructure. Roman society, as it developed, came to rely heavily on the labor of slaves to maintain its power and growth. The ancient Romans had a clear hierarchical system, with a rigid division between the free citizens of Rome and the enslaved population. At the top of the social ladder were the Roman elites, senators, patricians, and wealthy landowners who controlled much of the empire's land and wealth. They were the masters who owned slaves, and their status was maintained by the labor of those slaves. Slavery was not confined to the rural or agricultural sectors. It permeated every level of Roman life. Urban slaves worked in wealthy households as servants, cooks, and cleaners, while others served in temples or in the homes of the political elite. Slaves could also be employed in retail, serving as shop assistants, and even as actors, musicians, or teachers. Wealthy Romans often employed slaves to manage their properties and businesses, and they relied on these workers to maintain their lavish lifestyles. The slaves who performed these roles were often educated, skilled, and occasionally even given privileges like private quarters or the ability to accumulate some wealth. The role of slaves in construction cannot be overstated. It is no surprise that the Romans' most iconic structures, the Colosseum, the aqueducts, the Roman baths, were all built by the hands of slaves. The construction of the vast infrastructure that supported the empire, from roads to bridges to temples, was an undertaking that could only be completed by large numbers of enslaved laborers. These monumental projects required incredible levels of manpower, and slaves were forced to work long hours under brutal conditions. For these laborers, the work was physically demanding, and the risk of injury or death was high. Those who survived the harsh conditions often suffered from lasting physical impairments, but their contributions were crucial in building the empire's legacy. Economically, slavery allowed the Roman Empire to flourish. Agricultural slavery was particularly important in providing food for the growing population of Rome and the surrounding provinces. Large estates, or latifundia, were worked by slaves, and their labor enabled the rich to enjoy vast quantities of goods at minimal cost. This enabled Rome's wealthy elites to concentrate on political power, military conquests, and the luxuries of urban life. The agricultural productivity that slavery supported contributed to Rome's ability to control vast territories, feeding both the Roman army and the population of the capital. However, the use of slave labor also created deep social divides. While slaves made up a large portion of the population, they were not considered part of the Roman citizenry. Citizens had certain legal rights, including the right to vote, own property, and appeal to the courts. Slaves, on the other hand, had no rights whatsoever. They were property bought and sold at will, and could be subjected to whatever their masters deemed fit, from punishment to forced labor. The disparity between the wealthy elite and the enslaved population created a stark division in Roman society. For the upper classes, the use of slaves allowed them to live in luxury without having to work themselves. Their wealth was built on the backs of the laboring poor and the enslaved, who were often considered to be beneath the notice of those in power. The treatment of slaves varied greatly depending on their role, their master, and their skill level. Household slaves often had better living conditions than those who worked in the fields or mines. For example, a domestic slave in a wealthy Roman household might have had a relatively comfortable life, with access to better food, clothing, and living arrangements. Some household slaves even received a form of education, learning how to read, write, and manage their master's business affairs. In contrast, a slave working on a farm or in a mine would be subjected to grueling physical labor and harsh conditions, with little hope for improvement. Punishment, as we discussed, was a constant threat in the life of a Roman slave. Even slight disobedience could result in severe punishment, ranging from whipping to crucifixion. Roman law permitted masters to treat their slaves however they wished, and the punishment for any transgression was often brutal. Crucifixion, a method of execution reserved for slaves and criminals, was a public spectacle designed to instill fear into both the slaves and the free citizens. These executions were a reminder of the absolute power that masters held over their slaves and the consequences of attempting to rebel or escape. But despite the pervasive cruelty, there were moments of hope for some slaves. Some were able to earn their freedom by saving money or by performing exceptional service to their masters. A small number of slaves could even purchase their freedom, a process known as manumission. Once freed, these individuals could enjoy a limited form of citizenship, although they still faced significant social and economic challenges. Freed slaves often found themselves in a precarious position in society, still viewed as inferior to freeborn citizens, and often forced to work in menial jobs or as clients of their former masters. Slaves also formed their own communities, often in the form of small, secretive networks where they could find support and solidarity. These networks were crucial for survival, offering slaves a sense of belonging and the possibility of mutual aid. In the face of constant hardship and oppression, slaves were not entirely without agency. They developed ways to resist their conditions, whether through small acts of defiance, the formation of alliances with other slaves, or participation in large-scale revolts, like the famous rebellion led by Spartacus. The economic foundation built on slave labor, however, came with a price. The existence of slavery created an underclass of people who were deprived of rights, freedom, and any meaningful hope for advancement. This underclass, while essential to Rome's economy, was the very source of much of its social unrest. As we conclude Section 2, we ask, what was the true cost of relying so heavily on slavery? How did the Roman Empire reconcile the brutality of its system with its grandeur? And what impact did this reliance on slavery have on the empire's eventual decline? As we reach the final section of our exploration into the life of a Roman slave, we turn our focus to the long-lasting impact of slavery on Roman society and the eventual consequences for the empire itself. While the system of slavery helped fuel the Roman Empire's economic and military dominance, it also sowed the seeds of social unrest, rebellion, and ultimately, a fragile foundation for the empire's future. Slavery in Rome was not a transient institution. It was deeply ingrained in the empire's economic, social, and political structures. As mentioned earlier, slaves formed the backbone of Roman agriculture, industry, and households. Without them, the Roman elite would not have been able to maintain their lifestyles, and the empire would not have been able to sustain its vast infrastructure. However, the very dependence on slaves created an imbalance in society that would eventually have repercussions. The social hierarchy in ancient Rome was defined by a clear distinction between free citizens and slaves. While freeborn Roman citizens could participate in political life, own property, and claim legal rights, slaves were considered property. This division not only reinforced the dominance of the wealthy elite, but also marginalized those who had no rights or status. The system of patronage, which formed the backbone of Roman social life, relied on the free citizens who held power and wealth, granting favors and protection to clients, including freed slaves. This further entrenched the division between the privileged elite and the powerless underclass. For the enslaved, the possibility of freedom, while rare, provided a glimmer of hope in an otherwise bleak existence. Some slaves earned their freedom through exceptional service, while others bought their freedom with money they managed to save, sometimes with the assistance of their masters. Once freed, a former slave could become a freedman or freedwoman, though their new status did not guarantee equality. Freed individuals were still subject to social stigmas, and while they gained legal rights, they were often relegated to the lower echelons of Roman society. Freed slaves could not hold political office or achieve the status of a true Roman citizen, and their economic opportunities were limited. Despite this, a small percentage of freed slaves went on to achieve modest success as artisans, traders, or small landowners. The Roman elite, however, continued to exploit the labor of slaves, using them as tools to further their own wealth and power. The reliance on slave labor remained pervasive throughout Roman society, from the massive estates worked by slaves to the gladiatorial games that entertained the masses. The latter is especially notable, as gladiators, many of whom were slaves, were forced to fight in the arenas for the amusement of the Roman public. Gladiatorial combat became a brutal form of entertainment that fed into the Roman fascination with power, control, and violence. Despite the economic reliance on slaves, however, the brutality of the system eventually led to resistance, both overt and covert. Rebellions, such as the famous Spartacus revolt of 73 BCE, are a testament to the deep dissatisfaction and resentment felt by many slaves. Spartacus, a gladiator who had been enslaved, led a rebellion that challenged the very foundation of Roman power. Though the revolt was crushed and Spartacus was ultimately killed, it highlighted the fragility of the Roman system. The consequences of such rebellions were severe. Thousands of slaves were executed, many crucified along the Appian Way as a public reminder of the consequences of defiance. Yet, despite their defeat, slave revolts like Spartacus revealed the potential for social unrest within the empire. Slavery also had profound psychological and cultural effects on both the enslaved and their masters. For the slaves, the constant threat of punishment, disempowerment, and the lack of personal agency created a climate of fear, despair, and rebellion. The sheer brutality of the system, coupled with the idea that one's fate was entirely in the hands of a master, could strip away a person's sense of identity, dignity, and self-worth. The harsh reality of life as a slave left little room for self-expression or personal development. Slaves lived under constant scrutiny, and their only escape from this oppressive reality was often through small acts of resistance, like feigning illness, sabotaging work, or attempting to escape. For the masters, the system of slavery created a disconnect from the labor that sustained their wealth and power. The Roman elite's dependence on slaves to perform their everyday tasks removed them from the physical demands of work. As a result, the upper classes were often disconnected from the very realities of the empire they controlled. Slaves performed the labor that allowed the elite to focus on politics, military conquests, and leisure, creating a stark contrast between the lives of the powerful and the powerless. The system of slavery reinforced this divide as the wealthy continued to accumulate more power, while the enslaved remained at the bottom of the social ladder. The Roman Empire's reliance on slavery ultimately left a legacy that shaped not only its social structure, but its eventual decline. As the empire expanded, so did the demand for slaves. At the same time, as the empire's military and economic power began to falter, so did its ability to maintain this vast system of enslavement. The economic strain caused by the constant expansion and over-reliance on slave labor contributed to Rome's internal decline. The Roman economy, built on the backs of slaves, became unsustainable, and the empire's military was increasingly unable to control its vast territories. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century CE is often attributed to a combination of factors: economic decline, political instability, and invasions from barbarian tribes. However, the deep-rooted reliance on slavery, combined with the exploitation and marginalization of the lower classes, played a significant role in weakening the empire. The tension between the elites and the masses created a volatile society, one that was ripe for collapse. In the aftermath of Rome's fall, slavery continued in various forms throughout Europe and the Mediterranean. The Roman system of slavery left an indelible mark on the ancient world, and its legacy would continue to shape societies for centuries to come. The remnants of Roman slavery, both in terms of social hierarchy and the economic exploitation of labor, influenced the development of feudalism in medieval Europe and the transatlantic slave trade centuries later. As we reflect on the impact of slavery in ancient Rome, it becomes clear that the system was not just an economic institution. It was a cornerstone of Roman identity and power. Yet, despite its importance, the inherent injustice of the system led to inevitable conflict, rebellion, and social upheaval. The lives of Roman slaves may have been marked by suffering, but their struggle for freedom and equality left an indelible mark on history. When we imagine life in medieval castles, our minds often conjure images of grand halls, knights in shining armor, and noble feasts. But behind the stone walls and towering ramparts, the reality for the majority of people in medieval Europe was far from glamorous. For the peasants who worked the land, life was a constant struggle for survival, with few luxuries, harsh labor, and constant subjugation to the whims of their lords. The medieval peasant lived under a feudal system, a hierarchical structure where land was held by the nobility, and the peasants were the laborers who cultivated it. This system was based on mutual obligations. Peasants worked the land, and in return, the lord of the manor would offer them protection and the right to live on the land. However, this protection came at a steep cost. Peasants had to pay rent, work the lord's fields, and provide other services, such as building roads or maintaining the lord's castle. For many peasants, life began at dawn. The day's work was demanding, starting early in the morning and often extending until dusk. The majority of medieval peasants were farmers who worked the land, but their lives were dictated by the seasons. The winter months were harsh, with cold temperatures and little to do but mend tools and prepare for the upcoming planting season. The spring, however, was a busy time, as crops were planted and the land was tended to. During the summer, peasants worked long hours, harvesting the crops and caring for livestock. The fall was the time for harvesting and storing food for the harsh winter ahead. The work itself was physically exhausting. Plowing fields, sowing seeds, and harvesting crops were labor-intensive tasks that required strength and endurance. Tools were rudimentary, often consisting of wooden plows, sickles, and hoes. Peasants didn't have access to the advanced agricultural techniques we are familiar with today. They relied on their own knowledge of the land, passed down through generations, to grow crops like barley, wheat, oats, and rye, which were staples of their diet. In addition to farming, peasants were also responsible for caring for livestock. Cattle, pigs, sheep, and chickens were common on medieval farms. The care of animals required constant attention, as they provided not only food, but also materials like wool and leather. However, the risk of disease and malnutrition meant that livestock often died prematurely, further contributing to the hardships of peasant life. One of the most significant burdens for peasants was the obligation to work on the Lord's land. This was known as corvée labor, a form of unpaid labor required of peasants. In exchange for the right to farm their own plots, peasants were expected to work on their lord's estate for a set number of days each week, maintaining roads, repairing buildings, or working the Lord's fields. This was in addition to the time spent on their own land, which left little room for rest or leisure. Living conditions for peasants were harsh. Most peasants lived in small, simple homes made from wood, stone, or wattle and daub. These homes were often cramped and lacked basic comforts. The floors were typically dirt or straw, and the roof might leak during rainstorms. Families slept together in these small spaces with little privacy or comfort. Furniture was minimal, and the kitchen consisted of a simple hearth where meals were prepared. Food was also a constant concern. While peasants had access to grains, vegetables, and some meat, their diet was limited and monotonous. Bread was the mainstay of the peasant diet, often made from barley or rye, and supplemented with vegetables like cabbage, onions, and turnips. Meat was a rare treat, usually reserved for special occasions or as a byproduct of raising livestock. Peasants relied heavily on ale and cider, which were safer to drink than water, and often provided a modest source of calories. Despite the grueling work and basic living conditions, peasants were also bound to the land by the system of serfdom. While not slaves, serfs were not free to leave the land they worked on. They were tied to the Lord's estate and could not leave without the Lord's permission. In addition to the physical labor, peasants were also required to pay taxes to the Lord and the church. These taxes were often levied in the form of crops, animals, or labor, making it difficult for peasants to accumulate wealth or improve their circumstances. The legal rights of peasants were limited. They had little recourse if they were wronged by a lord, and any disputes were often settled in favor of the nobility. In some cases, lords could demand physical punishment for disobedience or failure to meet obligations, further reinforcing the power dynamics that defined medieval society. Punishments could range from a simple fine to more severe measures, such as flogging, imprisonment, or even execution, depending on the nature of the offense. The social divide between peasants and the nobility was stark. The lords, who lived in castles or manor houses, enjoyed the benefits of their position, plentiful food, comfortable living conditions, and the ability to command others. Meanwhile, peasants toiled away in the fields, struggling to survive with little hope of improving their lot. The nobility's wealth was often built on the labor of the peasantry, but this relationship was one of exploitation rather than mutual benefit. The lord may have provided protection, but it was the peasants who did the actual work. Despite the hardships of peasant life, medieval peasants had a strong sense of community. Villages were often close-knit, and families worked together to accomplish the necessary tasks. Festivals, religious observances, and community gatherings provided moments of relief from the daily grind. While life was often brutal and unyielding, peasants found solace in their faith, traditions, and the support of those around them. As we come to the end of this section, we ask, how did peasants reconcile their suffering with their role in sustaining medieval society? Could they see any light in a system that seemed designed to keep them in perpetual poverty? What motivated them to continue, generation after generation, despite the hardships they faced? As we delve deeper into the life of the medieval peasant, we must acknowledge the role of social and religious frameworks that shaped every aspect of their existence. In medieval Europe, religion was not merely a belief system, it was the backbone of society. It provided a moral structure, a justification for the feudal system, and a sense of hope for the afterlife. The Church, with its powerful influence over both the rulers and the ruled, played a critical role in the daily life of peasants. Their social relationships were often defined by the rigid hierarchy of the time, where peasants were at the bottom of the ladder, looking up to the clergy, nobility, and royalty. The medieval world was divided into three distinct estates: the clergy, the nobility, and the peasants. This tripartite system was not just a social structure, it was a religious and moral framework that governed how society operated. The clergy, responsible for the spiritual welfare of the people, were considered the most important, followed by the nobility, whose responsibility was to govern and protect the land. At the bottom of this hierarchy were the peasants, who, though the backbone of society, were considered to exist solely to serve the higher estates. The Church played a critical role in shaping the daily lives of peasants. Medieval Christianity, which was deeply entrenched in the lives of the common people, provided the framework for how peasants understood their place in the world. The Church taught that suffering was part of life on earth, and that it was the peasant's duty to endure hardship. Salvation, the Church promised, was attained through patience, hard work, and humility. This message was reinforced through the teachings of the clergy and the constant presence of religious imagery and rituals in everyday life. For peasants, the belief in the afterlife was one of the few ways to find comfort amidst the grinding poverty and harsh living conditions. Religious festivals, saints' days, and the liturgical calendar offered peasants brief moments of respite from their labor. These were times for communal gatherings, feasting, and prayer. The local church was often the focal point of village life, with services conducted in Latin, a language most peasants could not understand, yet which still imbued the proceedings with a sense of reverence. Despite the often incomprehensible rituals, the Church provided a sense of order and purpose, offering a promise of eternal life for those who fulfilled their duties on earth. While the Church's teachings emphasized humility and the acceptance of one's station in life, it also wielded considerable power over the daily lives of peasants. Tithes, which were a form of tax paid to the Church, were mandatory. Peasants were required to give a portion of their crops, livestock, or income to the local church. This was in addition to the taxes they owed to their feudal lords, though these tithes were meant to support the clergy and the church's charitable works. They often exacerbated the peasants' poverty, as much of the wealth generated by their labor went directly to the church. Beyond the financial demands, the church also played a role in legal matters. The clergy often served as judges in local disputes, and the church courts had jurisdiction over matters of morality, such as adultery, blasphemy, and heresy. The power of the church courts extended far beyond religious matters. They could impose fines, order penance, and even excommunicate individuals. Excommunication was a potent tool, as it cut off the individual from the spiritual community, leaving them without the hope of salvation. For a peasant, the threat of excommunication was a powerful form of control. The feudal system, which structured much of the medieval peasant's life, was also framed by a rigid social hierarchy. A peasant's life was marked by a series of obligations to the land, to the lord, and to the church. The feudal contract was not one of equality. Rather, it was based on the idea that the peasants owed loyalty, labor, and tribute to their lords in exchange for the right to work the land and live on it. The lords, in turn, provided protection, usually in the form of a small garrison of soldiers or a fortified castle to defend against external threats. While the lord's duty was to protect the peasants duty was to serve the lord in various ways, working his land, repairing his buildings, and paying taxes. At the center of this hierarchical structure was the manor, a self-sufficient unit that served as the focal point of medieval peasant life. The manor included the lord's estate, the peasant cottages, the village church, and the surrounding farmland. Each manor was essentially a small, isolated world where the peasants worked under the supervision of the lord's agents. It was within this framework that peasants navigated their lives, shaped by a combination of economic demands, social expectations, and religious obligations. While the lord controlled the manor, it was often the wife of the lord, the lady of the manor, who exercised a great deal of control over the day-to-day affairs. The lady of the manor was responsible for overseeing the running of the household, managing the staff, and sometimes even the collection of taxes or rents. She was the one who would ensure that the manor was running smoothly, though she was typically confined to the domestic sphere. The lord and his family, often living in a castle or large manor house, enjoyed a lifestyle of relative comfort, while peasants continued to struggle on the land, working long hours for little reward. The roles of women in the medieval peasant household were largely defined by the demands of the farm. Women were responsible for domestic tasks, such as cooking, cleaning, and raising children, but they also worked alongside their husbands in the fields, planting, weeding, and harvesting. Despite their heavy workload, women were generally expected to be subservient to their husbands and were often not allowed to own property or make decisions on their own. They too were bound by the same feudal obligations and were expected to contribute to the survival of the household in any way they could. The medieval peasant's worldview was shaped by this deep entanglement of social, economic, and religious factors. It was a life that demanded sacrifice and submission, but it was also a life in which peasants found meaning and purpose. In a society where so little was in their control, religion, community, and the structured social hierarchy gave peasants a way to make sense of their suffering. As we conclude Section 2, we must reflect on how these deeply ingrained social and religious systems shaped the lives of peasants. How did the church and the feudal system contribute to the oppression of the peasantry? And in what ways did peasants navigate these systems of control to find meaning in their difficult lives? As we arrive at the final section of our exploration into the life of the medieval peasant, we must turn our attention to the ways in which peasants, despite the crushing weight of their circumstances, resisted, survived, and in some cases, revolted against the structures that oppressed them. Despite the overwhelming odds, the story of the medieval peasant is not one of passive submission, but one of resilience and occasionally rebellion. Their actions, whether through small acts of defiance or large-scale uprisings, left a lasting legacy that would influence the course of medieval history. One of the most famous and significant uprisings in medieval Europe was the Peasants' Revolt of 1381 in England. The revolt, sparked by a combination of economic hardship, high taxes, and social unrest, saw thousands of peasants and common folk rise up against the oppressive feudal system. At its core, the revolt was a response to the growing power of the monarchy and the nobility, who placed an ever-increasing burden on the peasant population. The introduction of a poll tax, which required every adult to pay a flat rate regardless of income, pushed the already impoverished peasants to the breaking point. Led by figures like Wat Tyler and John Ball, the Peasants' Revolt was characterized by its sheer scale and the direct confrontations with the ruling elite. The peasants marched to London, storming through towns, burning manorial records, and seeking to bring the plight of the common people to the attention of the king. In the end, though the revolt was crushed, the legacy of the rebellion endured. The demands of the peasants, such as the abolition of serfdom and the reduction of taxes, were not immediately met, but they set the stage for future reformations in English society. The revolt also served as a reminder of the explosive potential of peasant discontent, demonstrating that even the most oppressed classes could rise up when pushed too far. While uprisings like the Peasants' Revolt were dramatic, they were far from the only form of resistance that peasants engaged in. More often than not, the forms of resistance were quieter, but no less significant. The act of breaking tools, sabotaging crops, or feigning illness were all forms of protest that allowed peasants to resist the overwhelming demands placed upon them without open confrontation. These small acts of defiance were ways for peasants to reclaim a modicum of power and agency in a society where they had very little. The church, too, played a complicated role in the life of the medieval peasant. While the clergy reinforced the social hierarchy and supported the existing order, the church also provided peasants with a sense of solidarity. Many peasants found comfort in their religious faith, attending Mass, partaking in communal prayers, and celebrating religious festivals. The church often acted as a mediator between the Lord and the peasant, offering spiritual guidance, as well as a place of refuge during times of hardship. For some, the idea of divine justice offered a form of solace, the belief that, though they might suffer in this life, they would be rewarded in the afterlife for their humility and endurance. Despite the difficult conditions, the peasantry also left behind a lasting cultural legacy. Medieval peasants contributed to the development of agricultural techniques, the spread of craft traditions, and the establishment of village communities that would endure for centuries. These communities, while often isolated, were not entirely without agency. They could negotiate with lords, barter goods, and form alliances with other villages. Peasants were not just laborers. They were also the makers of goods, traders of local products, and stewards of the land. Over time, their influence on the broader economic and social systems began to be felt, as they played a role in the economic exchanges that allowed feudal society to function. In the centuries that followed, the legacy of medieval peasants continued to shape European society. The transition from feudalism to more modern forms of governance and economics saw a gradual shift in the power dynamics that had defined medieval life. By the early modern period, the traditional structures of serfdom were gradually dismantled, and peasants gained more freedom to own land, trade, and even engage in the broader political life of their communities. The resilience of medieval peasants, while often unacknowledged in history books, was fundamental in pushing forward these changes. Their persistence in the face of unimaginable hardship laid the foundation for the development of a more equitable society. The challenges they faced and the ways in which they resisted oppression can be seen as a precursor to the broader social movements that would later emerge in the Renaissance and beyond. In the end, the legacy of the medieval peasant is one of quiet but unwavering strength. Theirs was not a life of opulence or grandeur, but one of endurance and survival against the odds. Though they were bound by the feudal system and often subjugated by the nobility and the church, peasants fought for their dignity, their survival, and their place in history. They may not have wielded the power of the nobility or the clergy, but their contributions, both seen and unseen, were vital to the growth of medieval society. As we reflect on the lives of these peasants, we are left with an important question. How did their everyday acts of resistance, whether large or small, contribute to the eventual dismantling of the feudal system and the rise of modern society? The story of the medieval peasant is not just one of oppression, but of resilience rebellion, and a quiet, unyielding determination to survive. When we think of the Vikings, our minds often conjure images of ferocious warriors, their longships cutting through the waves as they raid coastal villages and monasteries across Europe. The very term Viking has become synonymous with plunder and pillage, yet this view is only part of the story. The Vikings, those seafaring Norsemen from Scandinavia, were not just raiders, they were also traders, explorers, and settlers. Their impact on the medieval world went far beyond the violence of their raids. In fact, trade played a central role in Viking society, and their raids, often seen as acts of wanton destruction, were frequently motivated by economic necessity rather than mere bloodlust. The Viking Age, which spanned roughly from the late 8th century to the 11th century, saw the Norsemen extend their influence over large swaths of Europe, the British Isles, and even as far as North America. While many of their early expeditions were indeed focused on raiding, the Vikings quickly evolved into savvy traders and explorers. They established extensive trade networks that spanned from the Baltic Sea to the Mediterranean, and even as far as the Middle East and Asia. The Viking raids, often depicted in popular culture as violent, chaotic events, were in many cases targeted at specific areas of strategic economic importance. Coastal monasteries and villages were frequent targets, not out of a desire to terrorize the local population, but because they were rich in resources, particularly valuable goods like silver, religious artifacts, and precious metals. These early raids were often opportunistic, taking advantage of the relatively unprotected coastal settlements, which were an easy target for the swift Viking longships. However, these raids were not indiscriminate acts of violence. The Vikings were well aware of the importance of trade routes and sought to control access to these routes in order to acquire goods that were essential for their survival and prosperity. The Vikings were skilled craftsmen and agriculturalists, but they lacked the resources, particularly metal and luxury goods, that other cultures could provide. Raiding was a way to acquire these resources, but trade was the long-term solution. The Vikings' involvement in trade began to expand significantly in the 9th and 10th centuries. They established settlements, such as those in York, Dublin, and Normandy, where they could safely trade goods like furs, timber, and slaves for metals, textiles, and wine. The Vikings quickly became known for their craftsmanship in weapons, jewelry, and shipbuilding, which they traded with cultures across Europe. They also became major players in the slave trade, particularly in the Mediterranean, where they exchanged slaves for goods such as silver and luxury items. Perhaps one of the most important trade routes for the Vikings was the so-called Silk Road of the North, which connected the Viking world to the Byzantine Empire and the Islamic Caliphate. Through these trade routes, the Vikings obtained valuable goods like silk, spices, and advanced weaponry, while also providing the traders with goods from the north, such as amber, furs, and iron. The Vikings' ability to control and protect these trade routes, often by force if necessary, was central to their economic success. Additionally, the Vikings were master navigators, able to sail long distances across open seas using only rudimentary maps and their knowledge of the stars. This skill in navigation allowed them to not only raid and trade, but also explore new lands. The Vikings are famously credited with reaching North America, where they established temporary settlements in places like Newfoundland, hundreds of years before Columbus made his famous journey. Their travels took them to the shores of North America, the Mediterranean, the British Isles, Russia, and even the Middle East. The Viking settlements in places like Iceland and Greenland were not just military outposts, they were hubs of trade and cultural exchange. The Vikings established their own legal systems, marketplaces, and trading practices in these new territories. Over time, they developed a sophisticated trading culture that was deeply intertwined with their need for economic growth and the maintenance of power. But while Vikings were deeply involved in trade, their raiding culture is still widely recognized. So, why did they continue raiding if they were such successful traders? The answer lies in the combination of factors that defined Viking society. First, the harsh conditions of the Scandinavian environment meant that Viking society was always under economic strain. The need for resources like land, cattle, and wealth drove the Vikings to explore and expand, while trade offered a solution. Raiding provided immediate wealth, a way to acquire resources quickly to support the Viking way of life. Moreover, the Viking warriors' desire for honor and glory, which was deeply ingrained in their culture, played a role in their raiding activities. In Viking society, warriors were highly regarded for their bravery and success in battle. The raiding expeditions provided a way for Vikings to gain fame, wealth, and prestige. The rewards of battle were not just in the form of goods, they were also in the form of status within Viking society. Victory in battle could elevate a warrior's reputation, bringing him not only wealth, but also a place of respect among his peers. The relationship between raiding and trading was not one of mutual exclusivity. Rather, the two were complementary. A successful raid could provide the resources necessary to fuel future trading endeavors, while a trading route could offer access to wealth that would enable further raids or the establishment of new settlements. For the Vikings, both raiding and trading were essential to their survival, expansion, and cultural identity. As we reflect on the Viking Age, we must ask ourselves, were the Vikings primarily raiders, or were they far more adept as traders and explorers? Did the violent raids of the early Viking Age serve as a stepping stone for the eventual transformation of the Vikings into merchants and settlers? In the end, it becomes clear that the Vikings were not just barbaric raiders, but rather dynamic actors in the medieval world, whose complex trade networks and cultural exchanges were just as significant as their military exploits. As the Vikings advanced into the heart of Europe, their settlements evolved beyond mere military outposts. These newly established communities began to serve as vibrant hubs of trade, culture, and politics, significantly altering the medieval world. Over time, the Vikings not only conducted raids, but also played an essential role in the development of Europe's trade networks, which were critical to their success as both traders and settlers. The Vikings' ability to establish strong and lasting settlements was one of their most important achievements. As they expanded into the British Isles, Ireland, Normandy, and even parts of Eastern Europe, they took control of strategic locations that allowed them to dominate trade routes. Perhaps the best known example is Dublin, which became one of the most important Viking trading cities in Europe. By the 9th century, Dublin had evolved from a small Viking base into a thriving port city, with bustling markets where goods from all over the world were exchanged. From furs and iron to silk and spices, Dublin became a key center in the Viking trade network, linking the North Sea to the Mediterranean and the East. In addition to their settlements in Ireland, the Vikings also established prominent colonies in Normandy, which would go on to have a profound impact on the history of Europe. The Danish invasion of England, led by Sweyn Forkbeard, and later his son Cnut, created a large Viking kingdom that spanned across parts of England, Scandinavia, and even Denmark. With their rule over large swaths of territory, the Vikings exerted control over both the land and the sea. These regions became critical nodes in the Viking trade empire, with cities like York in England and Hedeby in Denmark functioning as major trade centers, facilitating the exchange of goods between the Vikings and other European cultures. The Vikings' settlements were not just military fortifications, they were economic powerhouses. The Vikings excelled in adapting their new lands for agricultural use, introducing new farming techniques that allowed them to produce the goods needed to sustain both their own population and the trade economy. They cultivated crops like barley, rye, and oats, and raised livestock such as cattle, sheep, and pigs, which were valuable commodities in trade. The expansion of Viking settlements created a network of towns and villages, each of which played a role in producing goods for trade, such as grain, wool, and fish, while also providing services such as shipbuilding, a skill in which the Vikings were unmatched. One of the key factors that set the Vikings apart from other raiders and conquerors was their ability to integrate themselves into existing trade networks and expand upon them. Rather than simply plundering resources and moving on, the Vikings sought to establish long-term trading relationships with the peoples they encountered. This allowed them to take part in lucrative industries such as the fur trade, the slave trade, and the exchange of luxury goods. For example, the Vikings traded furs and timber with the peoples of the East and even the Middle East, bringing back valuable goods such as silver, wine, and spices in return. The Viking longship, a technological marvel, was crucial to the expansion of Viking trade. The longship's design allowed the Vikings to travel both across open seas and along inland rivers, giving them access to trade routes that were otherwise inaccessible to other cultures. It was a versatile vessel, capable of carrying both warriors and merchants, enabling the Vikings to engage in both raiding and trading missions. Viking merchants used these ships to navigate the European rivers, connecting the Baltic to the Mediterranean and facilitating the flow of goods, ideas, and cultural exchange. One of the most impressive feats of Viking trade was their role in the Silk Road of the North, a network that linked Scandinavia to the Byzantine Empire, the caliphates of the Middle East, and beyond. This route stretched from the Vikings' strongholds in the north down through Russia and into Constantinople, allowing for the exchange of goods such as silk, gold, spices, and other luxury items. Viking merchants, often referred to as Varangians, became intermediaries in this vast trade network, connecting the east to the west. This trade not only allowed the Vikings to acquire valuable resources, but also exposed them to new cultures, technologies, and religions. The Vikings' connection with the Byzantine Empire was especially important. They were instrumental in the functioning of the Byzantine economy, providing mercenaries for the emperor's elite guard, the Varangian Guard. Many of these Viking warriors, having gained wealth and prestige through their service, brought back precious goods, including gold and silks, to their homelands. These goods were often traded for northern products, creating an early form of international trade between the Vikings and the Byzantine Empire. The connection with the caliphates also introduced the Vikings to a wealth of knowledge in fields like mathematics, astronomy, and medicine, all of which would later influence the development of Viking society. This combination of raiding and trading allowed the Vikings to accumulate considerable wealth, which they used to strengthen their settlements, build fortifications, and expand their territories. While they continued to raid throughout the Viking Age, their long-term success lay in their ability to control and dominate trade routes, establishing a far-reaching commercial network that spanned the entire northern hemisphere. As Viking merchants and settlers established strongholds in various parts of Europe, they helped facilitate the exchange of goods and ideas that laid the foundation for the early medieval European economy. But Viking involvement in trade wasn't purely economic. It also played a key role in the social and cultural development of their society. The wealth generated by trade helped support the growth of Viking culture, from art and literature to political institutions and social structures. As Viking kingdoms flourished, they began to develop more centralized political systems, with leaders like King Cnut of England, Denmark, and Norway acting as both rulers and key figures in international diplomacy. These leaders used their power and wealth to maintain trade relations with other cultures and kingdoms, further embedding Viking society into the European political landscape. In conclusion, while Viking raids are often remembered for their violence and destruction, they were only one part of a much larger and more complex reality. The Vikings were not just raiders, they were traders, explorers, and settlers who helped shape the medieval world through their connections, trade routes, and cultural exchanges. Their raids were often the means by which they gained the resources necessary to fuel their long-term economic ambitions. But it was their involvement in trade that truly allowed them to prosper. The Vikings left behind a legacy of both pillage and prosperity, a duality that highlights the complexity of their society. As the Viking Age drew to a close in the 11th century, the character of Viking expansion and interaction with the rest of the world underwent a significant transformation. While Viking raids became less frequent, the trade networks they established continued to thrive, laying the foundation for the medieval economy and European growth. By the end of the Viking Age, the once feared raiders had become integral players in the complex web of international trade, diplomacy, and culture. The decline of Viking raids can be attributed to a combination of factors, including the rise of more organized and powerful states in Europe, the Christianization of Viking society, and the increasing stability in the regions the Vikings once terrorized. As the Viking kingdoms in Scandinavia transitioned into more centralized monarchies, their leaders, such as King Harald Hardrada of Norway, shifted their focus from raiding to consolidation and trade. The rise of feudalism in Europe and the establishment of stronger defenses against Viking incursions also made further raids less feasible and profitable. The Christianization of the Vikings played a key role in the decline of their raids. As Vikings converted to Christianity, both at home in Scandinavia and in their conquered lands, their worldview shifted. Christianity promoted a moral code that condemned the raiding practices that had once been central to Viking identity. In addition, as Christian kings and leaders emerged in the Nordic region, they adopted the more stable and peaceful methods of governance, focusing on trade, diplomacy, and alliances rather than on plunder. One of the most significant impacts of Viking conversion to Christianity was the shift in their interaction with the European world. Vikings who had once sacked monasteries and religious centers for their wealth were now drawn into the Christian fold, receiving protection from the church and forging alliances with Christian monarchs. By the early 11th century, Viking leaders like King Cnut the Great of England, Denmark, and Norway sought to consolidate power through peaceful means, such as marriage alliances and diplomatic negotiations, rather than through raids. With the decline of raids, the Vikings turned more fully to trade as a means of wealth. The trade networks they had established over the centuries continued to expand and evolve. Viking towns, ports, and cities became central hubs for the exchange of goods across Europe. The Vikings traded in commodities like furs, timber, amber, and slaves, while acquiring luxury goods such as silk, spices, and precious metals from the Middle East and Byzantium. This trade was vital to the economies of the regions they settled, and it helped shape the cultural and social development of the medieval world. Novgorod in Russia and Dublin in Ireland were two of the most important Viking trading cities. These cities became melting pots of cultures as Vikings interacted with local populations, exchanging not just goods, but also ideas and customs. Novgorod, in particular, played a crucial role in the development of trade between the Vikings and the Byzantine Empire. Viking merchants, known as Varangians, facilitated the flow of goods between the East and West, linking Scandinavia with the Black Sea and Constantinople. This trade route, often referred to as the Volga trade route, connected the Viking world to some of the most advanced and prosperous civilizations of the time. Viking influence on trade also extended to the development of currency systems in Europe. The Vikings were instrumental in the spread of silver as a form of currency, particularly in regions like England and Ireland, where they had established settlements. Viking coins, known as setas, were used not only for trade, but also as symbols of political authority. These coins were often minted by Viking kings or rulers, and were used to establish the legitimacy of their rule in the lands they controlled. As the Viking world became more integrated into the European economic system, it contributed to the growth of a more interconnected medieval Europe. The Vikings helped establish trade routes that would later be used by merchants in the Middle Ages, linking the Baltic to the Mediterranean, the North Sea to the Atlantic, and the British Isles to the continent. This expansion of trade networks allowed for the exchange of not only goods, but also knowledge and technology, accelerating cultural developments across Europe. Despite the decline of Viking raids, the legacy of their trade networks endured. Viking settlements such as York, Dublin, and Hedeby remained vital trading centers for centuries. These towns served as key nodes in the broader European economy, facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and cultures long after the Vikings had ceased to raid. The Viking influence on European trade and economy is still evident today, as many modern European trade routes and cities can trace their origins back to Viking settlements and trade networks. The Vikings' role as traders and explorers marked a significant shift in their place within the European world. While their early reputation as violent raiders was well earned, their legacy as pioneers of trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange has become just as significant in the historical record. The Vikings' ability to adapt and evolve from ruthless invaders to shrewd traders helped shape the development of medieval Europe, providing the foundation for the growth of towns, markets, and global trade networks that would continue to expand for centuries. As we reflect on the Viking Age, we must reconsider the conventional image of the Vikings as mere raiders. Their story is one of adaptation, survival, and transformation of a people who, over time, became integral to to the cultural and economic landscape of medieval Europe. The Vikings' mastery of the seas, their connections to distant lands, and their role in shaping early European trade networks remain crucial to understanding the development of medieval society. The question remains, how did the Viking transition from raiders to traders affect the broader European economy and political structures? And how did the Viking ability to integrate trade with their raiding culture influence the future of Europe's economic systems? When we think of ancient Egypt, towering monuments come to mind: massive pyramids, imposing statues, and grand temples that seem to defy the sands of time. These architectural marvels, particularly the Great Sphinx of Giza and the Great Pyramids, are symbols of Egypt's enduring legacy and power. However, the story behind these monuments is not just one of grandeur, but of immense human labor, devotion, and a vision for eternity that spanned generations. The construction of Egypt's most iconic structures was not only an act of architectural achievement, but also a manifestation of the pharaohs' power, religious beliefs, and the complex social systems that enabled their creation. The Sphinx, with its lion's body and human head, has captured the imagination of people for centuries. Standing watch over the Giza Plateau, the monument is one of the most famous symbols of ancient Egypt. But its construction is shrouded in mystery, with debates over its origins and the identity of the pharaoh it represents continuing to this day. Many scholars believe that the Sphinx was commissioned by Pharaoh Khafre, a ruler of the Old Kingdom, and is a representation of his divine power and connection to the gods. While the Great Sphinx remains one of Egypt's most iconic monuments, it is the pyramids of Giza that truly embody the grandeur of the ancient Egyptian civilization. These colossal structures, particularly the Great Pyramid of Khufu, have been a subject of fascination and awe for centuries. Standing as the tallest man-made structure in the world for over 3,800 years, the Great Pyramid was a monumental achievement in both engineering and design. The sheer scale of the pyramid, constructed from millions of stone blocks, is a testament to the advanced understanding of mathematics, engineering, and labor organization that the ancient Egyptians possessed. The construction of the pyramids was not an overnight process. It took decades to build each pyramid, and the labor required to complete them was immense. Thousands of workers, skilled laborers, craftsmen, and laborers who may have been conscripted were involved in the construction of these great monuments. While many people believe the pyramids were built by slaves, recent evidence suggests that the workers were likely skilled laborers who worked in shifts and were well fed and housed. These workers were not merely building tombs, but contributing to the pharaoh's divine purpose. The construction of the pyramids involved meticulous planning and organization. The massive stone blocks, often weighing several tons, were quarried from distant locations and then transported to the construction site. Recent studies have revealed the ingenuity behind this process, with evidence of advanced ramp systems, levers, and sledges used to move the stones into place. The construction site was an organized hub of activity, with workers, supervisors, and engineers all coordinating efforts to ensure the massive project moved forward. The planning behind the pyramid's design was also extraordinary. Careful consideration was given to the alignment of the structure with the stars, as well as the dimensions and internal chambers. The tombs were designed not just as final resting places for the pharaohs, but as symbols of their divine status and power. The pyramids were built to house not only the mummified remains of the pharaoh, but also the vast wealth and offerings that would accompany him into the afterlife. The belief in the afterlife was a central aspect of Egyptian religion, and the construction of these tombs was part of a much larger religious and cultural system. The idea was that the pharaoh, upon death, would ascend to the heavens and join the gods, ensuring the continuation of cosmic order for Egypt. The pyramid was a key part of this process, serving as both a tomb and a gateway to the divine realm. The Sphinx, though smaller in comparison to the pyramids, plays a similar role in Egyptian religious belief. The monument is often seen as a symbol of strength, wisdom, and protection. The Sphinx faces the rising sun, its gaze directed toward the eastern horizon, symbolizing the pharaoh's connection to the sun god, Ra, and his power over life and death. It is said that the pharaoh's divine power was reinforced by the gods, and monuments like the Sphinx served as physical manifestations of this belief. The Sphinx, with its mighty form and inscrutable face, continues to watch over Egypt, a silent witness to the civilization's grandeur and decline. While the physical construction of the monuments is awe-inspiring, it is the belief system that truly gives them meaning. The pharaohs were not simply rulers of Egypt. They were seen as gods on earth, intermediaries between the divine and the mortal world. The pyramids, temples, and the Sphinx were constructed to honor the gods, to secure the pharaoh's place in the afterlife, and to affirm Egypt's divine order. As we examine the construction of these monumental structures, we are faced with the question: how were the resources, labor, and organization required to construct these monuments obtained and managed? The task of building the pyramids and the Sphinx was a monumental feat that required not only engineering ingenuity, but also a vast social and economic infrastructure. The labor needed for such massive projects likely involved thousands of workers, and the state played a central role in organizing this labor. Some of these workers would have been conscripted, while others, especially skilled craftsmen, would have been permanent employees. The workers were housed near the construction sites, and their sustenance was provided by the state. The organized system of labor and resources, along with the advanced technology used in the construction, reveals a society with remarkable organizational skills. The construction of these monumental structures was also deeply tied to Egypt's economic system. The The state controlled agricultural production, and the wealth generated from taxes, tribute, and trade helped fund such massive undertakings. The labor required to quarry and transport the stones was provided by both skilled and unskilled workers who were housed in nearby workers' villages. These workers were organized into teams, each responsible for different tasks, from quarrying and transporting stones to assembling the monument itself. This system of labor organization reflects the highly centralized nature of Egypt's political and economic systems, where the pharaoh wielded absolute power over all resources. As we conclude this section, the key question emerges. What drove the pharaohs to commit such vast resources to building monuments like the pyramids and the Sphinx? Was it merely a testament to their power, or was it part of a larger vision to ensure their divine place in the afterlife and the prosperity of Egypt itself? These monuments were not just built to impress. They were meant to endure, to stand the test of time, and to affirm Egypt's place in the world as a center of power, culture, and religion. The erosion and rediscovery of the Sphinx and pyramids, while the construction of the pyramids and the Sphinx was a monumental achievement in the ancient world, the story does not end with their completion. Over the centuries, these grand monuments suffered the ravages of time, weathering, erosion, and neglect. The very forces that had brought these structures into existence would eventually contribute to their decline. Yet, in the process, the monuments also underwent a transformation from symbols of divine power to relics of a forgotten past. Their rediscovery, centuries later, would spark new waves of interest and intrigue, bringing the ancient world back into focus. The great Sphinx of Giza, once a proud and imposing figure, began to deteriorate long before modern archaeologists began their work. As the centuries passed, the forces of nature took their toll on the monument. The limestone from which the Sphinx was carved began to erode, particularly its face, which was once strikingly detailed. Sandstorms, the harsh sun, and the encroaching desert all contributed to the gradual wearing down of the monument. By the time the Middle Ages rolled around, the Sphinx had become largely buried in sand, and its once grand features were barely discernible. As for the pyramids of Giza, their grand structures began to suffer as well. Though the stone blocks that made up the pyramids were strong, the external casing of smooth limestone that once covered them was slowly removed over time. The casing stones, which had once gleamed brilliantly in the sunlight, were taken by later civilizations to be repurposed for building projects. As a result, the pyramids gradually lost their smooth, polished appearance, and their rough internal stone structure was revealed. Despite these signs of decay, the pyramids and the Sphinx continued to be held in awe by the people of Egypt and beyond. For centuries, the true purpose and construction methods behind these monuments remained clouded in mystery. While ancient historians like Herodotus wrote about the grandeur of Egypt's monuments, they lacked the understanding of how such feats were accomplished. The true origins of the Sphinx and the pyramids were lost to time, and the monuments gradually became the stuff of legend and folklore. However, the Renaissance period, with its renewed interest in the classical world, brought Egypt and its monuments back into the intellectual spotlight. During this time, European scholars and explorers began to rediscover the ancient monuments of Egypt, including the Sphinx and the pyramids. These monuments became a source of fascination for the growing intellectual movement, as scholars sought to understand their construction, purpose, and significance. In the early 19th century, European expeditions to Egypt became more frequent, and these efforts led to the rediscovery of many ancient sites. The Napoleonic expedition to Egypt 1798-1801 was one of the most significant turning points in the modern study of ancient Egyptian monuments. Led by scholars and scientists, this expedition mapped out Egypt's ancient sites and brought much-needed attention to the monumental structures of Giza. Napoleon's army may have been there to conquer, but the scholars who accompanied him were there to uncover the secrets of the ancient world. Following the Napoleonic expedition, the field of Egyptology was born, and scholars such as Jean-François Champollion, who famously deciphered the Rosetta Stone, began to decode the rich history embedded in Egypt's monuments. This marked the beginning of a new chapter in the study of ancient Egypt, where the monuments were not only seen as awe-inspiring, but also as tangible records of a rich and complex civilization. The Sphinx itself became a focal point for excavation and restoration efforts. By the early 20th century, work began to uncover the Sphinx from the sands that had buried it for centuries. Excavations in the 1920s and 1930s, led by Egyptologist Howard Carter and others, revealed new details about the Sphinx, although its original purpose remained elusive. Theories about the identity of the pharaoh depicted in the Sphinx, as well as the monument's role in Egyptian religious practices, continued to evolve. The mystery surrounding the Sphinx and its construction led to a wealth of speculation. Some theories suggested that the Sphinx was built long before the reign of Pharaoh Khafre, perhaps even as early as the time of the Old Kingdom or the pre-dynastic period. Others argued that the Sphinx was a symbol of the sun god Ra, a creature embodying both earthly power and divine protection. New discoveries and advanced technologies, such as satellite imaging and ground-penetrating radar, have continued to fuel debates over the Sphinx's age, purpose, and construction methods. Similarly, the pyramids of Giza have been the subject of intense study and fascination. Over the centuries, historians, archaeologists, and engineers have worked to understand how these massive structures were constructed without the modern tools and machinery that we take for granted today. Many have marveled at the precision of the pyramids' design, particularly the alignment of the Great Pyramid with the cardinal points of the compass. Various theories have been proposed regarding the construction methods, ranging from the use of straight and zigzagging ramps to the possibility of advanced knowledge of mathematics and geometry. In addition to their physical deterioration over time, the pyramids also faced challenges during Egypt's later periods of occupation. The monuments were sometimes neglected or defaced by later rulers who sought to assert their own power over the previous pharaohs. Nevertheless, the pyramids retained their status as symbols of divine kingship, and throughout Egyptian history, they remained objects of respect and reverence. By the mid-20th century, Egypt's monumental legacy was well recognized around the world, attracting tourists, scholars, and archaeologists from all corners of the globe. Today, the Giza Plateau, home to the Great Pyramids and the Sphinx, remains one of the most visited archaeological sites in the world. However, even as modern technologies continue to reveal more about the construction and significance of these monuments, much of their original purpose remains shrouded in mystery. Some aspects of Egyptian civilization, its religion, its royal ideology, and the true methods of pyramid construction continue to elude our understanding. As we look at these incredible monuments today, the question arises: why have they endured for so long? What makes the pyramids and the Sphinx not only symbols of Egypt's power, but also lasting expressions of human ingenuity and devotion to the divine? Perhaps it is because these monuments are more than just stones and statues. They represent the aspirations of a civilization that sought to achieve immortality, to ensure the pharaoh's place among the gods, and to demonstrate the might of a nation that would leave an indelible mark on history. As the centuries have passed, the Great Sphinx of Giza and the Pyramids of Giza have transcended their original roles as monumental tombs and symbols of divine kingship. Today, they stand not only as enduring testaments to the power and engineering genius of ancient Egypt, but also as iconic symbols of human achievement, culture, and history. Their legacy extends far beyond the Egyptian context, influencing art, architecture, literature, and even modern popular culture. The cultural significance of the Sphinx and the pyramids has evolved significantly since their construction. In ancient Egypt, the pyramids were primarily seen as the final resting places for the pharaohs, the ultimate expression of their divinity and eternal rule. The pyramids were designed to ensure that the pharaoh's soul would successfully travel to the afterlife, where it would join the gods and continue to govern Egypt from the heavens. The Sphinx, on the other hand, represented the pharaoh's strength, wisdom, and divine protection, serving as both a guardian of the sacred spaces and a symbol of royal power. However, as time passed, the meaning of these monuments began to shift. During the later periods of Egyptian history, the pyramids, and particularly the Sphinx, became more than just royal tombs. They became symbols of Egypt's grandeur and timelessness. They were revered as national treasures, embodying the strength and cultural pride of the Egyptian people. even after the fall of the pharaonic dynasty. These monuments continued to stand as icons of the ancient world, transcending their original religious and political functions. By the time of the Greek and Roman periods, the Sphinx and the pyramids were already considered ancient wonders. The Greeks and Romans admired these structures, often interpreting them through their own cultural lenses. The Greek historian Herodotus, 5th century BCE, wrote about the pyramids in his histories, marveling at their size and the ingenuity required to build them. However, he also fell victim to many of the myths and inaccuracies that surrounded these monuments, suggesting that the pyramids were built by slaves, a misconception that has persisted in popular culture until modern archaeological research debunked it. In Roman times, the Sphinx and the pyramids were further romanticized, often depicted in works of art and literature. Roman emperors, including Julius Caesar and Augustus, were known to have visited Egypt and marveled at these ancient wonders. The Sphinx, in particular, became a symbol of the mystique and power of Egypt. Roman writers such as Pliny the Elder and Strabo celebrated the monuments, and the Sphinx in particular became a symbol of the divine and the eternal. During the Islamic period, which began in the 7th century CE, the Sphinx and the pyramids continued to captivate the imagination of scholars, travelers, and rulers. The Arab historian al-Makhrizi wrote extensively about the pyramids, describing them as the wonders of the world. However, in this period, Egypt's monuments also became the subject of myth and speculation, with various stories emerging about the purpose and origins of the Sphinx. Some medieval Islamic writers even speculated that the Sphinx was a representation of the mythic creature Hercules or other figures from Greco-Roman mythology. By the Renaissance in Europe, Egypt's ancient monuments had become central to Western cultural rediscovery. Scholars and artists were fascinated by the grandeur and mystery of the pyramids and the Sphinx. The Renaissance marked a period of great intellectual curiosity, as the rediscovery of classical antiquity prompted European thinkers to look to ancient Egypt for inspiration. Artists such as Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo incorporated elements of Egyptian art and symbolism into their works. The Sphinx and the pyramids, once again, became symbols of the eternal quest for knowledge, innovation, and human achievement. In the 19th century, Egypt underwent significant changes under the rule of Napoleon Bonaparte and later the British Empire. Napoleon's Egyptian campaign, 1798-1801, was a pivotal moment in the modern history of Egyptology, as scholars, scientists, and artists accompanied him to Egypt to document and study the ancient monuments. The Rosetta Stone, discovered during this campaign, was key to deciphering Egyptian hieroglyphs, opening the door for a deeper understanding of the language and culture of ancient Egypt. This period also saw the beginning of modern archaeological efforts to preserve and understand the pyramids and the Sphinx. Archaeologists and Egyptologists began to excavate, document, and preserve these ancient sites, uncovering artifacts and inscriptions that provided valuable insights into the lives of the pharaohs and the construction methods used to build the pyramids. One of the most significant discoveries came with the unearthing of the tomb of Tutankhamun in 1922 by Howard Carter, which further sparked global interest in ancient Egypt and its monumental legacy. Today, the Great Pyramids of Giza and the Sphinx continue to be icons of Egypt's rich cultural heritage. They attract millions of tourists each year, drawing people from all over the world who seek to experience the majesty and mystery of these ancient wonders. Modern technology has enabled archaeologists to study the pyramids and the Sphinx in unprecedented detail. Techniques such as ground-penetrating radar, 3D mapping, and satellite imaging are used to uncover hidden chambers, study the construction techniques, and gain a deeper understanding of how these monumental structures were built. Despite these advancements, however, many questions remain unanswered, adding to the allure and mystique of Egypt's monuments. The influence of the pyramids and the Sphinx extends far beyond Egypt itself. These monuments have inspired countless works of art, literature, and architecture. The symbolism of the pyramids of death, rebirth, and the journey to the afterlife has found its way into modern culture, influencing everything from popular films to architectural design. The Sphinx, with its enigmatic expression, continues to serve as a symbol of mystery and wisdom, evoking a sense of awe and wonder. In addition to their cultural and artistic impact, the pyramids and the Sphinx are also central to the study of Egyptology and the broader field of archaeology. Scholars and researchers from around the world continue to study these monuments, seeking to unlock their secrets and understand the civilization that built them. The ongoing efforts to preserve and protect these monuments are a testament to their enduring significance and their role in shaping our understanding of human history. As we conclude the story of the Sphinx and the pyramids, we are left with the thought-provoking question: why do these monuments continue to captivate our imaginations after thousands of years? What is it about the grandeur, mystery, and history of the pyramids and the Sphinx that continues to inspire awe and wonder? Perhaps, in their enduring presence, they remind us of the enduring power of human creativity and ambition, the desire to leave a legacy that transcends time. The Mongol Empire, founded by Genghis Khan in the early 13th century, became the largest contiguous empire in world history, stretching across vast stretches of Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. But what truly set the Mongols apart from other empires was not just their military might and conquest, but their remarkable ability to survive and thrive in some of the harshest climates on Earth. The Mongols' ability to endure extreme cold, vast open steppes, and brutal winters is a testament to their resilience, adaptability, and the unique way of life that Genghis Khan instilled in his people. The Mongols originated from the harsh, cold steppes of Central Asia, where extreme temperatures, freezing winters, and scorching summers shaped their survival strategies. The Mongolian Plateau, located between the Altai Mountains to the west and the Siberian forests to the north, is one of the most inhospitable environments on the planet. The winters in this region can see temperatures dip as low as degrees C, minus 40 degrees F, with biting winds and little shelter from the elements. Yet it was in this very environment that the Mongols forged their legendary strength and resilience. The Mongols were not just a people accustomed to survival in extreme cold, they were masters of it. Unlike the settled agricultural civilizations that thrived in fertile river valleys, the Mongols were nomadic herders. Their way of life centered around the raising of livestock, such as horses, sheep, and cattle, was uniquely suited to the harsh conditions of the steppes. The Mongols developed a deep understanding of the natural world, and their survival was tied to their intimate knowledge of the land, the weather, and the resources available to them. In the brutal winters of the Mongolian steppes, the Mongols relied heavily on their livestock for food, clothing, and shelter. Their diet consisted largely of meat, milk, and fermented dairy products, which provided them with the necessary nutrients to survive the cold months. The Mongols were particularly skilled in preserving food for the winter, using techniques such as drying and fermenting meat and dairy to ensure they had enough supplies to last through the harshest seasons. Their yurts, portable, felt-covered tents, served as their primary shelter. Designed to withstand extreme cold and wind, the yurts provided warmth and protection from the elements. The yurts were heated by wood-burning stoves and could be easily disassembled and transported, making them ideal for a nomadic lifestyle. The insulation provided by the felt coverings and the warmth from the stoves allowed the Mongols to remain comfortable even in freezing temperatures, giving them a distinct advantage in their harsh homeland. Beyond the physical adaptations that allowed them to survive the cold, the Mongols also developed psychological resilience. Their culture was one of endurance, where hardship was seen not as a challenge to be feared, but as an essential part of their identity. Genghis Khan, the founder of the Mongol Empire, emphasized strength and toughness in his leadership, often testing his soldiers' ability to withstand the harsh elements. He instilled in his people the idea that survival was a matter of willpower, and that the Mongols should not be daunted by the environment, but use it to their advantage. This mindset was crucial to the Mongols' success in their military campaigns. The Mongols' ability to endure long marches in freezing temperatures without the need for lavish supplies or comforts allowed them to outlast their enemies. Their armies, composed of skilled horsemen, could travel vast distances at high speeds, covering up to 100 miles a day in some cases. This mobility was a key factor in their military success, as they could strike quickly and decisively, often catching their enemies off guard. Moreover, the Mongols' endurance in the winter months enabled them to conduct winter campaigns, a strategy that many other armies of the time could not execute. The Mongol Empire's ability to wage war in the winter months was a major advantage, especially when it came to invading regions like the Kievan Rus and China, where the winters were equally harsh. Unlike other armies that would hibernate or retreat during the colder months, the Mongols pressed on, taking advantage of the weather to gain an upper hand in battle. Despite the brutality of the winter conditions, the Mongols managed to maintain a level of prosperity and stability in their own territories. The nomadic lifestyle was highly efficient, with the Mongols' ability to move quickly and settle in different areas based on seasonal conditions, ensuring that they could make the most of their limited resources. This adaptability was critical not only to their survival, but also to their success as conquerors. The Mongols were able to thrive in an environment where most other civilizations would have faltered. And this resilience allowed them to extend their empire across much of Asia and into Europe. The Mongols also developed a system of communication and intelligence that was highly effective in harsh climates. They used a vast network of messengers and scouts who were able to traverse difficult terrain in any weather, ensuring that information could be relayed quickly across the empire. This system of communication allowed the Mongols to coordinate their military efforts and keep their armies well supplied and informed, even during the coldest months. As the Mongols expanded their empire, they encountered a variety of climates, from the freezing steppes of Central Asia to the sweltering deserts of the Middle East. Their ability to adapt to different environments was one of their greatest strengths. While they were masters of survival in the cold, they also learned to thrive in hot, arid conditions, using the same principles of mobility, resilience, and resourcefulness to conquer new lands. Their nomadic lifestyle, though rooted in the cold steppes, allowed them to survive and even flourish in some of the harshest environments on Earth. As we consider the Mongols' success in surviving and thriving in the harshest of winters, one must ask, how did this ability to endure extreme climates shape the Mongol Empire's military and social structure? And how did their approach to survival in the cold contribute to the expansion and longevity of their empire? The Mongols' ability to survive the harshest winters was not only a matter of personal resilience, it was deeply tied to their military strategy, which made them one of the most formidable fighting forces in history. Their success in cold climates wasn't just about enduring the weather, it was about adapting their tactics and leveraging the winter elements to gain an advantage over their enemies. These strategies allowed the Mongols to conduct winter campaigns that many other armies would have avoided due to the severity of the cold. Mongol military tactics, particularly during the winter months, were built around the speed, mobility, and flexibility of their cavalry. The Mongols were famed for their highly disciplined and versatile cavalry, which could sustain long-distance marches, endure extreme temperatures, and strike rapidly, often before their enemies had a chance to mount a defense. Their light cavalry, particularly the archers, were able to cover vast distances at remarkable speeds, enabling them to carry out surprise attacks on enemy forces during the harsh winter months, when other armies would have been vulnerable to the cold. The Mongols' ability to adapt to and take advantage of the winter weather gave them an unparalleled edge in battle. Unlike other armies of the time, which would retreat to warmer climates or hibernate during the winter months, the Mongols continued their military campaigns regardless of the season. In fact, their military prowess in the winter months became one of their most powerful tactics, as the cold and snow worked to their advantage, slowing down enemy armies and making them more susceptible to Mongol raids. One of the key aspects of Mongol winter campaigns was their understanding of the environment. The Mongols were intimately familiar with the conditions of the land they occupied, particularly the steppe regions, where they had lived for centuries. They knew how to move efficiently across frozen landscapes, using their horses, which were accustomed to the cold, and their yurts as mobile bases for winter expeditions. The horses themselves were highly trained to withstand freezing temperatures, able to graze on the sparse winter grasses, or even survive by eating the snow itself, if necessary. Winter also allowed the Mongols to take advantage of frozen rivers and lakes, which were often used as pathways for their cavalry. As many of their enemies lacked such knowledge, Mongol soldiers could quickly traverse areas that others considered inaccessible during the winter months. This strategic advantage gave them not only mobility, but the ability to surprise enemy forces who may have believed that winter would force the Mongols to retreat. By maintaining their momentum and carrying out strikes in the cold, the Mongols were able to disrupt their enemies' plans and wreak havoc on the political and military infrastructure of rival kingdoms. Genghis Khan, who was responsible for uniting the Mongol tribes and expanding their empire, recognized the immense value of these winter tactics. His military genius was not only in his battlefield prowess, but in his strategic use of seasonal conditions to overwhelm enemies. Genghis Khan used winter to his advantage, timing his attacks during periods when his enemies were least prepared to defend against his swift and aggressive cavalry. Another aspect of Mongol military success in winter was their logistical capabilities. The Mongols were able to maintain supply lines during the winter months by relying on the same networks they had established for winter trade and travel. They would use their scouts and messengers, highly trained in winter survival, to maintain contact between different parts of their empire and coordinate their military efforts, while other armies would suffer from supply shortages during the cold months. The Mongols had a system in place that allowed them to stay fed, equipped, and mobile in ways other forces could not. The Mongols also developed a sophisticated method for psychological warfare, which was magnified by their winter campaigns. The speed and ferocity of their attacks, combined with the winter weather, created a sense of fear and helplessness in their enemies. When Mongol forces swept through regions during the coldest months, they would often strike with overwhelming force, using surprise and the harsh conditions to their advantage. This intimidation often caused the collapse of enemy resistance before battles even occurred. The Mongols' ability to maintain constant pressure in freezing temperatures left their enemies feeling outmatched and disoriented. Not only did the Mongols conduct raids during winter, but they also used the season to establish long-term dominance over the lands they had conquered. As they expanded into Russia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe, the Mongols maintained control over vast regions by exploiting the cold climates. The harsh winters allowed the Mongols to establish strongholds in areas that might otherwise have been impossible to defend during the warmer months. The Mongols created alliances with local tribes and peoples who understood the land's challenges and helped the Mongols control vital trade routes during the winter months. In addition to these military advantages, the Mongols also understood the importance of keeping their armies healthy and prepared during the winter. While harsh conditions were an undeniable part of their campaigns, the Mongols took great care in maintaining the well-being of their soldiers. Mongol troops were known for their discipline and self-sufficiency, but they were also well-provisioned. Mongol warriors were given adequate food, clothing, and shelter to survive harsh conditions. Their furs, leather armor, and high-quality winter boots were specially designed for the cold, keeping them warm even in sub-zero temperatures. The Mongols also took advantage of their vast network of trading partners to supply their armies with the necessary materials. This allowed them to keep their military forces equipped and prepared, even in the most extreme conditions. Their control of key trade routes allowed them to secure essential resources, including weapons, food, and medical supplies, which were critical for long-term campaigns in the cold. As we reflect on the Mongols' ability to conduct successful winter campaigns, it becomes clear that their survival and dominance in the harshest climates were not just a matter of enduring the cold, but of actively using it to further their military and economic goals. Their knowledge of the land, their adaptation to extreme conditions, and their ability to outmaneuver and outlast their enemies made them one of the most formidable military forces in history. The Mongol Empire's success in the winter months reveals a profound understanding of strategy, resource management, and military psychology. As we examine their legacy, the question arises: how did their ability to survive and thrive in extreme conditions contribute to the establishment of the Mongol Empire as one of the most powerful and enduring empires in history? And how did the winters of the Mongol Empire shape the course of world history? As we explore the Mongol Empire's resilience in the harshest winters, it becomes clear that their success was not solely due to their ability to to endure the cold, but also because of their unmatched adaptability and ingenuity in leveraging their environment for military, economic, and cultural dominance. Their winter strategies and survival tactics left an indelible mark on both the medieval world and the subsequent evolution of military and cultural practices. The Mongol Empire, with its mastery of survival in some of the most brutal climates on Earth, created a legacy that still influences military tactics and strategic thinking today. The Mongols' ability to navigate the cold, open steppes with ease, their expert horsemanship, and their expert use of the environment laid the groundwork for some of the most effective military strategies ever devised. Their mobility, combined with their strategic use of winter conditions, became a hallmark of their military prowess, allowing them to outlast and outmaneuver enemies across vast distances and diverse climates. The Mongols' winter campaigns, particularly their ability to conduct operations during the coldest months, were a clear demonstration of their military dominance, using the environment not as an obstacle, but as an opportunity to strike with overwhelming force. Modern military strategists often study the Mongols' logistics, their rapid deployment strategies, and their ability to sustain operations in the most extreme conditions. The Mongols were, in essence, ahead of their time in terms of their understanding of supply chains, terrain navigation, and communication systems. Their use of fast-moving cavalry, the coordination of intelligence networks, and the effective utilization of local resources allowed them to maintain their offensive campaigns, even in freezing winters. These tactics influenced later military leaders, including Napoleon Bonaparte and Adolf Hitler, both of whom attempted to apply similar strategies in harsh winter conditions, though with varying levels of success. Perhaps one of the most important aspects of the Mongol Empire's winter campaigns was their psychological warfare. The Mongols were experts at sowing fear and confusion in their enemies, often by leveraging the harshness of winter to create a sense of inevitability in their advances. Their swift attacks, brutal raids, and ability to maintain control in freezing conditions gave them a psychological advantage, as their enemies were often overwhelmed by the seeming relentlessness of Mongol campaigns. This psychological edge, coupled with their tactical superiority, enabled the Mongols to expand their empire rapidly. The Mongols' adaptability extended beyond military conquest. The empire's vast size and diversity required them to integrate various cultures, people, and resources from all corners of their territory. They ruled over regions ranging from the frigid steppes of Siberia to the arid deserts of the Middle East, and from the frozen plains of Russia